So thank you, Heather, and thank you very much, ladies and gents, for coming along on this rather chilly morning to hear me talk about this chap, Reverend Alexander or Sandy Reynolds, and I'm delighted that we're joined this morning also by Georgina, his daughter Georgina Spencer. So between us, hopefully we can sort of paint a picture of his life. And if you have questions at the end that I can't answer, because obviously I know predominantly about the Second World War period rather than subsequently, then Georgina, I'm sure, will chip in as well. Forgive me if I'm a little bit croaky as well. I'm the tail end of a slightly unpleasant cold. So I sort of gurgle and moan a little bit and go and get some water every now and again. That's why. And thank you, Heather, also about the 2-minute silence as well. So if I'm just halfway through something and the bell goes, I'll stop. We'll have the 2-minute silence and then I'll resume, okay? So, yes, my subject this morning is Reverend Reynolds and his experience in Northwest Europe during the Second World War. I came to this subject really as somebody who's been interested in the 1944 Normandy campaign for a long time. Like most people, I grew up with the kind of Hollywood movies watching on a Sunday afternoon, Zulu and things like that. And The Longest Day, of course, was one of the movies that, you know, I'm sure many of you in this room will have seen. So I've always been interested. I spent much of my childhood in and around Church Crookham, so not terribly far from here. And Aldershot at that time was, you know, the home of the British Army, rather less so now. So again, I had a lot of friends who were in the army and those sorts of things, or whose fathers were in the army in particular. I arrived at Sandhurst in 1993. So I've been there almost 27 years now as a lecturer in the War Studies department. And about a year after arriving in 1994, I was asked, well not asked, I was told, to go to Normandy with Normandy Company of the Sandhurst Cadets. Our cadet companies at Sandhurst, as you may know, are named after famous battles. So Ypres Company, Normandy Company, Somme Company and so forth. And in 1994, at the 50th anniversary commemorations, Normandy Company of Sandhurst Cadets were the British representatives. So at the big international ceremony at Omaha Beach or at Bayer, meeting the Queen and all that sort of stuff, it was Normandy Company marching up and down. But the Sandhurst HQ wanted them to know a little bit about the battles that they were actually commemorating or celebrating. So I was sent out there, and when they weren't parading up and down, we went and visited some of the battlefields. And that really started off for me an interest in the Normandy campaign, or perhaps built an interest in the Normandy campaign, which has really mushroomed ever since. So I've been back to Normandy on many occasions since then, in particular to deliver battlefield studies for either British Army and sometimes international military audiences, and then in more recent years also for civilian audiences, so I do it as a kind of commercial thing as well. I've written a lot of books about, or contributed various things. I've written a book did a series in 2004 called Battle Zone Normandy, some of which were republished in 2011, which was 14 volumes, well over 500,000 words, which was, I was the editor, and I found out what series editing means. It means rewriting large chunks of other people's books, but that's fun. And I've dared to bring along a copy of a reprint of those which are for sale at a princely price of £6 if anybody's interested. So that's about Gold Beach, which is where Sandy Reynolds landed. In 2012, I did a book of official military photography in Normandy. So this is a book about the work of the official military photographers, not the press photographers like Robert Capa, who are more famous. And again, I've got some copies of that if you're interested. In 2009, I was doing some TV stuff over in Arromanches for the anniversary again. And after I got back, I was contacted by Georgina, who sent me a letter saying, I saw you doing this on television, and would you be interested in looking at my father's journal? And we talked a little bit, and it became clear that Georgina's father rather had landed on Gold Beach, which was my particular interest. I'd written a book about it. And he was a chaplain. And I knew nothing really about military chaplaincy. It was not a subject that I'd ever researched. My brother is a vicar actually, but I hadn't sort of looked at that kind of dimension of personal experience particularly. So I was quite interested to read it. Had a look at the journal. We met up and had a look at the journal. I thought it was very well written. It's a very easy read. It's about 22,000 words in its original form. And that it really deserved to be published because it kind of casts light on that particular niche experience of soldiering in the Northwest European campaign. And, you know, the literature on the Normandy campaign is huge. There are thousands of books and articles that have been written about it. But actually, very few of them come from this particular perspective of military chaplaincy. And a rather surprisingly small number actually are well-written accounts from the personal perspective. They tend to concentrate more on, you know, the decisions made by generals and people like that, rather than the experiences of people like Sandy Reynolds. So I thought, yes, this deserves to be published, but it needed a certain amount of work. It was one solid block of 22,000 words. Needed to be broken down into chapters and needed sort of editorial interventions of various kinds. It also starts very abruptly, so there's nothing before May 1944, and it ends equally abruptly in November 1944. So it needed to be introduced, and there needed to be an epilogue, essentially, to describe what happened to Sandy Reynolds in the final stages of the war and subsequently. So I set to work, and it took a long time for various reasons I won't bore you with, and it came out earlier this year in this form. So that's the book which some of you may already have seen. So this is the chap that I'm talking about. The two photographs, we know roughly when this one was taken because you can probably just read at the bottom, it says South End. And the regiment to which he was attached, which I'll explain later on, the 120th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, had travelled all around the United Kingdom during the Second World War, but in February 1944 was in Southend. So that photograph was probably taken a few months after he joined the regiment. He joined the regiment in November 1943 as their chaplain, and that one was probably taken in February 44 or thereabouts. This one we're a little less sure about, Georgina. We don't have a firm date on this one.
He had leave sometime in the spring of 1944, and that was when that was taken.
It's difficult to tell, isn't it? Because he looks more youthful, at least to me, in this one than he does in this. You know, this looks like a man who's seen things.
I think it had dawned on him just what he'd taken on.
Yeah, maybe. It's interesting. Anyway, so and this is, of course, he's wearing the insignia of the Royal Army Chaplains Department, and you can see the 3 pips on his shoulder. So he was technically a chaplain to the force's 4th class, but that's a captain equivalency in terms of rank. So that's why he's wearing captain's rank insignia, essentially. So this is what I'm going to do with the talk, and I'm not quite sure how long this will take, but I'm sure Heather will keep an eye on it and signal me to accelerate if I need to. So I'm going to take it essentially chronologically. Okay, so we'll start with a little bit about Sandy's early life and how he got to be in the army, a little bit about the context within which he operated, so Montgomery's attitude to army chaplains and the role of the regiment to which he was attached and what they were supposed to do. But really the meat of it is in this area here, and I've simply taken the chapter titles of the book as I broke it down, and I'll sort of just orientate you to some of his experiences as we roll on through, and then obviously the post-war period as well, and then a little bit about the Copper Cross, which some of you may know about already. And then questions at the end, if you have any, I'll do my best, or Georgina and I will do our best to answer them for you. And I thought it might be quite nice to read some of the extracts from the journal as we go along. In particular, there's one, for me, particularly moving section of the journal. It's reasonably lengthy, but I'd like to read it to you at this time because I think it's a very powerful statement of one of the most traumatic experiences he went through. So this is Sandy in his earlier years. He was born in September 1906 in Blackburn, working class family background, the youngest of 9 children, I think, 9 children. Bright lad, got a scholarship to go to Blackburn Grammar School for Boys, and when he finished his schooling he became a clerk in a local textile mill. But that doesn't seem to have been a particularly fulfilling profession for him, and during his 20s he decided that he wanted to train as an Anglican priest, which he did. He went off to St Aidan's Theological College in Birkenhead, again with a scholarship to cover the fees, and eventually was ordained just a couple of years before the outbreak of the war in September 1937 at the age of 30. And this photograph is probably taken when he was a clerk in Blackburn. He became a curate at St Jude's in Blackburn, so his own hometown, and this was a church which in fact his family had helped to raise the money to construct in the first place some years earlier on. And he worked there with the Reverend James Parker, and while he was working at St Jude's, he met and later married Parker's niece by marriage, Nancy Christabel or Chris Jukes or Jukes, I never know. Jukes, exactly so. Okay. And the marriage, which again photographed down here, 24th of July 1940, within a few days of that, so this is after the outbreak of the war, obviously, he sent off to Winmarleigh, which was a small farming community about 15 miles northwest of Blackburn. It's just off the M6 on the left-hand side. If you're ever heading out that direction, it's not difficult to get to become the vicar there. Now, obviously, as I say, this is at a time when the Second World War had already broken out. And although we don't know a great deal about his experiences, he could hardly have failed to notice, the disappearance of the menfolk of military age. It's very interesting in the display at the back of the room, which I hope you'll have a look at before you go, some photographs and so forth from his life. There's a wonderful photograph of the garden party. That's there, isn't it? Yes. Of a garden party probably held in the summer of 1940 or 41. And there's bags of people there, but they're almost all women and children. Yeah, because the men folk have almost certainly either gone off to war or are in critical industries at the time. So although we don't know a great deal of his personal experience, he would have been aware of the stresses and the strains. He would have been subject to rationing and the blackout and all of the experiences that pretty much everybody in the United Kingdom went through during that part of the war. He would have been aware also by 1943 that at least one man from the village had died in action as a guardsman in North Africa, actually in Tunisia, just before the end of the North African campaign. Also in the summer of 1943, the army was very short, about 400 short, of Anglican chaplains. And he went on a big recruiting drive to try and get more chaplains into the army. And so he may have been responding to that. But for whatever combination of reasons, maybe he felt he wasn't doing his bit and so forth, he decided in the summer of 43 to enlist as an army chaplain. Now he had a daughter by this point, Georgina, and so it couldn't be taken for granted that he would be allowed by his bishop, the Bishop of Blackburn, to join the army, but the bishop gave his consent essentially to that happening. And so at the end of October 1943, Sandy was commissioned into the Royal Army Chaplains Corps as the chaplain to the forces 4th class, and immediately sent to the beginning of November to Tidworth, so not that far from here, to undergo a training course. And this photograph shows him at the end of his training course. It's a very standard military photograph. You will have seen bags of these, I'm sure, over the years. And Sandy's just in the back row here with other people of his class. And again, the photograph, did you bring this one, Georgina? No, okay. So the photograph contains the signatures of all of those shown. I'm not quite certain, but I think probably the front row, or certainly these two chaps in the middle in the front row, are the directing staff, the people with the paste sticks. But I think the others are probably the chaplains. It's only a 2-week course, so it's just designed to introduce them to some of the features of military life, map reading, some first aid skills, the kind of practical soldiering skills that they would require. Soon after, early 1944, probably heads back to Winmarleigh for a short period of leave. Here's Georgina, a number of years ago, on the steps outside the vicarage. So before we go on to look at Sandy's experiences in Northwest Europe, I thought it might be just helpful to tell you a little bit about the Royal Army Chaplains Department. The Army Chaplains Department dates back to 1796, so there had been chaplains ministering to the spiritual needs of soldiers and later sailors and airmen as well, ever since the end of the 18th century, if not before, in fact. But the royal bit comes along in 1919 and is essentially a formal form of recognition for the gallantry displayed by and the important role fulfilled by army chaplains during the First World War. It's really the prize that they get for their contribution, as epitomised perhaps in Chaplain Theodore Hardy, who was awarded the Victoria Cross as an army chaplain for various acts of gallantry, rescuing people under fire out in no man's land and so forth, and sadly died of wounds just before the end of the First World War in October 1918. And you can see something of the scale of military chaplaincy in the British Army in the First World War. Of course, the army was huge in the First World War and therefore required a very large number of chaplains, over 5,000. And that's of all denominations, predominantly Anglican chaplains, but also hundreds of Catholic chaplains, Church of Scotland, Methodists, Jewish chaplains, you know, pretty much the full range of religious denominations represented. In the Second World War, the army was smaller because, of course, the Royal Air Force existed as a gigantic organisation by World War II and took a very large part of the available military-age manpower in the British Isles in the Second World War. So the army was actually smaller in the Second World War than it was in the First, which accounts for why the number in World War II is rather smaller. But it grew, as you can see, spectacularly. So September 1939, the total strength of the regular, territorial and reserve forces in the army was about 900,000 men, so more than 10 times the strength of the British Army as it is today. And there were 820 serving chaplains. So it's a ratio of 1 to sort of about 1,100, 1,200, something like that. By halfway through the war, roughly speaking, the army had grown to the better part of 2.5 million men, and the number of chaplains had increased. So the ratio remains roughly the same as the war goes on. And altogether during the Second World War, just shy of 4,000 chaplains, again of all denominations, served. And lest it be thought that theirs was a safe, cushy, rear area kind of job, it absolutely was not. The number of fatalities suffered by the Royal Army Chaplains Department was really quite significant. So during the war, about 96 were killed in action or in accidents, or in particular in captivity in Japanese hands in the Far East, chaplains who went into captivity in Singapore and Hong Kong, places like that. And then there were several others who died as a result of war experiences, but technically speaking after the end of hostilities. So it's around 100, yeah, it's precisely 100, which at sort of not far off 3% is not as high as sort of infantry or armour, but it's certainly higher than most of the other branches of the army. So it tells you something about where these men were placing themselves during the war. They were placing themselves in places where they could get killed. And Normandy was in fact by far the single most intensive experience in terms of casualties amongst British Army chaplains. So this lists in the chronological sequence of their death the 20 fatalities amongst Royal Army Chaplains Department chaplains in Normandy, starting on D-Day with Reverend George Parry with the 7th Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, who was killed, probably shot by the Germans in Bénouville, just near Pegasus Bridge, in the morning of the 6th of June, and goes all the way through to pretty much the end of the Normandy campaign. Most of them were killed in action, KIA, mostly by shells or mortar bombs. So close enough to the front line to be exposed to enemy shelling. A couple of them died of wounds subsequently, and several died in accidents. Particular tragedy here, Cecil Hawksworth of the 6 Durhams was killed in a road traffic accident. The following day, when he was being buried by Gerard Nesbitt, a shell fell during the burial service and killed his friend Gerard Nesbitt in the 8th Durhams. So the 151st Durham Light Infantry Brigade lost 2 of its chaplains in the space of 2 days in early July. John Newson of the Dragoon Guards died in a drowning accident off the shore of Normandy, again during the campaign. And the last one drove over a mine. So there were 20 British chaplains who were killed in Normandy, also 3 Canadians and 9 United States Army chaplains, so 32 chaplains amongst the major Allied belligerents. I don't know about Poles and Norwegians and Dutch and Belgians and other minor allies, probably none, but there might have been 1 or 2 amongst them. So it's an expensive experience for the chaplains department. Let's just have a look at the time. Yeah, okay, I've got 5 minutes. So what sorts of things do army chaplains do then? Well, these are the main functions that have become quite clear by 1943, which is when, of course, Sandy Reynolds joins the army, becomes a chaplain. So these are laid down, for example, in this book, this rather slim volume by a chap called Middleton Brumwell, the Army Chaplain. Now, he was the Deputy Chaplain General of the Royal Army Chaplains Department, and this book is actually published in 1943 as a guide to what chaplains should essentially do. So Royal Army Chaplains Department had worked out by halfway through the war what sorts of jobs it should be doing and what sorts of jobs it really shouldn't be doing, was somebody else's responsibility. And almost certainly this would have been read by Sandy Reynolds when he was at Tidworth, if not before, because, you know, it's a useful source.
At 7 o'clock we will be observing the 2-minute silence of remembrance.
Okay, that's in 5 minutes. So the 5 sort of major areas, first and unsurprisingly, of course, conducting church services. Most British soldiers, when they joined the army, declared a religious affiliation. You know, only a tiny minority would have said that they were either atheists or even agnostic. So most soldiers would have been expected to attend sort of church parades and so forth. And so that's kind of staple diet, core business for Sandy Reynolds and other army chaplains. Again, because most soldiers declared a religious affiliation, and because the army saw spiritual guidance to soldiers as enhancing their effectiveness in battle, it was absolutely expected that chaplains would use every available opportunity to try and reinforce the fighting spirit, broadly speaking, of the soldiers who they were working with. And whether that be done through conventional means, such as the delivery of sermons during religious services, or padres' discussion hours, or on a more intimate one-to-one level, those are again the kind of bread and butter role that Sandy would have been fulfilling. During operations, things like church parades were pretty much suspended. Instead, you get things like this. This is a photograph taken in the fields of Normandy on the 10th of July 1944, with an army chaplain actually ministering to soldiers who are about to go into action. So away with the spit and polish and the attendant rigmarole of church parades and inspections of all of your kit, and to something much more practical and pragmatic out in the field. And chaplains, generally speaking, certainly those with combat units, position themselves with the dressing stations. So this photograph is taken during the battle for Langevre on the 14th of June. And although you can't pick it out from where you're sitting, this chap sitting in the middle of the dressing station, you can see a man on a stretcher here, yeah, is actually the chaplain of one of the infantry battalions involved in the action. Now, this forward dressing station is probably within 500-800 yards of the front line where the battle is actually raging. And again, although you can't see it in this photograph, some of the people sitting over here being treated are actually wounded German prisoners. Okay, so this is the kind of place where you would actually work very, very close to the front line to provide reassurance, in particular to wounded personnel. And so Sandy's first job on D-Day is to go to the beach dressing station and to see whether there's a need for him to fulfill that function with the wounded who are there. Particularly unpleasant, but absolutely core function is searching, identifying and burying the dead. This photograph shows a chap called Francis Sampson, who was a United States Army Padre in the 101st Airborne Division, reading a service at the burial of dead American paratroopers in the Cotentin Peninsula a few days after D-Day. He wrote a rather interesting memoir of his experiences in Normandy. So that's a very testing role, actually searching bodies for identification and so forth, and it's one which I'll come back to later. And then finally, sort of welfare work of various kinds. So many of the chaplains in pretty much all the armies were used to doing things like running boys' clubs or, organising entertainments as part of their ordinary parish duties. So this was something they were familiar with. There was also a kind of incentive to avoid giving soldiers the opportunity to go off to places like baths and brothels, where military indiscipline would reign. So better to organise acceptable entertainments and things like reading rooms and soldiers' clubs than to allow them free reign. So again, we'll come back to that later on. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Okay, it's going to stop in a second. We'll stop in a second, but it's important just to say a few words again for contextual purposes, about Montgomery's attitude. Now, Field Marshal, as he became general at the time, Bernard Law Montgomery, is the overall commander of 21st Army Group in Northwest Europe. So he commands the British and the Canadian forces throughout the Northwest European campaign. So as the top man within the military structure within which Alexander Reynolds served, it's important to understand what Montgomery's attitude was. Was he a supporter of chaplains, or was he somebody who regarded them as a sort of petty annoyance? Well, absolutely the former. And he made this point very clear. Of course, Montgomery himself came from a religious background. His father had been at one point the Archbishop of Tasmania. So as I was saying, Montgomery comes from a military background himself, and he was from a religious background himself, and he's a very, very strong supporter of the work of the Royal Army Chaplains Department. In North Africa, you know, he tried to give them as much ability to deliver what they perceived to be important as was humanly possible. So he says at one point, towards the end of the North African campaign, I would as soon think of going into battle without my artillery as without my chaplains, which is a pretty big statement for Montgomery. Anybody who knows anything about Montgomery's preferred fighting style, the way in which he conducted his battles, would know that artillery is absolutely at the centrepiece of his preferred fighting style. So if he's saying something like this, he really is raising the chaplains to a tremendously important position, and again something very similar from 1941. Later in the Northwest European campaign, at pretty much the point where the diary actually stops, Montgomery issues notes on the conduct of war in the infantry division in battle. I do not believe that a commander could inspire great armies or single units or individual men and lead them to achieve great victories unless he has a proper sense of religious truth. The importance of good senior chaplains is immense. Under them, the chaplains must be welded into a team, all singing the same song and to the proper tune. It should be clearly realised by all commanders that a thoroughly sound and healthy chaplains department is a very definite aid towards success in battle. So this very direct link between the kind of religious inspiration and the fighting spirit of the British Army in the Northwest European campaign as perceived by Montgomery. So the unit that Sandy worked with throughout almost all of his military service, at least regular military service, was the 120th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, which was one of a very large number of similar organisations formed and used by the British Army during the Second World War. It dated back to January 1942, when it was formed out of an existing searchlight regiment in Scotland. It was at Kilmarnock at the time when it was formed. And although its strength sort of waxed and waned at various times throughout the war, it was about 850 officers and men, typically. As its name kind of suggests, its job was to engage enemy aircraft, so Luftwaffe planes. And in order to do that, it had this kind of weapon, which is the 40mm Bofors gun. And the 40mm Bofors gun was essentially an automatic or semi-automatic heavy cannon that theoretically could fire to 16,000 feet in the air, but actually these tended to be used against low flying aircraft. So aircraft within about a mile's distance and to a maximum altitude of actually only about 3,000 feet. So low flying aircraft were the only ones that realistically you could engage with this kind of weapon. The regiment had 54 of these weapons, divided down into 3 batteries, each of 18 guns. Each gun commanded by a sergeant, typically, with a crew of about 8 men in order to operate it. There's no radar guidance or anything like that. As you can see, the chap is sitting here on the seat and is looking through a sighting mechanism in order to fire the gun at the planes that he can actually see flying towards him. 120th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment by D-Day hadn't fired a single shot at anger. All it had done in the United Kingdom was train and move around, okay? So it had achieved precisely no kills by June 1944. But nevertheless, it was part of an anti-aircraft brigade, so a multi-regiment or multi-battalion entity that had been allocated an important role in the Allied invasion of Northwest Europe, which specifically was to land on D-Day, or to start landing on D-Day, in order to protect the prefabricated or Mulberry Harbour that the Allies were taking with them. They were taking 2 actually to Normandy, in order to provide secure port facilities pending the capture of Cherbourg, Le Havre, Brest and other major existing ports which could then be exploited later in the campaign. I'll come back to that later on. In spring 1944, the 120th Air Regiment was chosen to provide intimate support to the landings on D-Day, specifically on Gold Beach, which was one of the 5 codenamed beaches on which the Allies landed on D-Day. To that end, it was going to land about roughly half of its weapons on D-Day or D+1 and then build up its strength over the next few days. And this was because there was a real fear, which seems a little bit odd with the benefit of hindsight, but seemed less odd at the time, that on D-Day the Germans would throw everything at driving the Allies back into the sea. That they would throw every available aircraft into attacks against the troops landing on the beaches and the ships offshore. And so you needed to land anti-aircraft units on the beach right at the start of the invasion. One of the bizarre things is that by the landing tables, anti-aircraft guns were actually supposed to go ashore several minutes before the assaulting infantry. You were going to put anti-aircraft guns onto the beach before the infantry arrived, which sounds absolutely remarkable, but if you look at the landing tables, is true. So a real fear, unjustified as it proved, but you've got to build in the danger. But a lot of the regiment was going to land on D-Day. Only the essential personnel would land in the first waves. Other people who you didn't need on the first few hours would turn up later. And these were what were known as residues. Small packages of people who were sent off to various places and told, well, you'll land on the afternoon of D-Day, you'll land on D+1. Some of you won't land until a fortnight after D-Day because we don't need you until then. And actually Sandy Reynolds is amongst one of those residues. So the invasion plan, just to be, you probably know most of this already, but obviously this is the area of Normandy within which the Allies' Operation Neptune Overlord takes place on D-Day the 6th of June. So you can see the Cotentin Peninsula jutting up, and then important places like Bayeux and Caen, critical road junctions marked on the map. The beaches where the Allies were going to land, 2 in the American sector, Utah and Omaha, and then Gold, British, Juno, Canadian, and Sword, again British, in the eastern part of the invasion sector. So this, just a few miles northeast of Bayeux, is where Sandy and the rest of his regiment were going to land on D-Day and for the days after. This is a little sort of inset map showing the area of Gold Beach specifically. So there are various towns and villages around. Arromanches is the place where the Mulberry Harbour, shown here in an aerial photograph, was going to be developed. So there's Arromanches just down there. Okay, so this is the port facility I was talking about. And then the beach stretching to the east, subsectors, codename Jig, King and so forth. And Sandy's regiment were actually going to land both on Jig and King to provide anti-aircraft support for the assault on D-Day. Sandy himself came ashore here on King sector of Gold Beach near the seaside village of La Rivière. And the regiment was dispersed during the Normandy campaign over this area. So there were guns dotted all over the place to provide low-level protection. Okay, so just to run through then some of the things that Sandy was doing during the period covered by his journal. So the first chapter of the journal covers the period from the 13th of May to the 7th of June, which is when the marching party, the group of about 20 men, led by Sandy, is sent off to a camp in East Anglia on the River Orwell, not far from Ipswich, around this big house, which is now a public school, boarding school, at Orwell Park. So on the 13th of May, which is weekend, Sandy was sent off with 20 people from the regiment as a residue to Camp R5, where they congregated predominantly with members of this formation, the 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats. Because the 7th Armoured Division was the first of the follow-on divisions. So on D-Day, various troops would land, but then they would need reinforcements. And one of the first divisions to land after D-Day would be the 7th Armoured Division, which would come down in a task force known as Force L, which embarked at places like Felixstowe in East Anglia, come through the Dover Straits down towards Normandy, and then start landing on the evening of D-Day and D+1. While he was there, he did various things, mostly watching and waiting really, but rather amusingly in the book there's a description of a wedding that he carried out. So he was walking through the lines at one point and somebody came up to him and said, are you a priest? My friend wants to get married. Can you organise that? So at very short notice in 24-hour period, he had to organise a wedding in an adjacent church, Nacton Church, which is just on the edge of Orwell Park, and carry that out. So there's a rather nice little bit in the book about that wedding. Along with everybody else, he's briefed at the end of May about the actual landing plan. Up until then, many of the soldiers had, trained and prepared for D-Day, but they didn't know where they were going. It was only at the end of May and in the first few days of June that they found out actually where they were going to land and precisely what their role in the invasion plan was. So he doesn't find out until the end of May, so about a week before D-Day. They then pass through what were known as sausages because on the map they look like that. They're concentration areas where troops are brought together into kind of corridors, and on a map they look like a row of sausages joining together until eventually you go through the sausage and land and load rather on your vessel that's going to take you to France. And that happened again for Sandy at the beginning of June, obviously, at Felixstowe, onto ships like these. These are Landing Ships Tank, which is a big ocean-going vessel. It displaces about 2,000 tons and could carry about 500 personnel or several dozen vehicles of various kinds, tanks and other kinds of vehicles. And this is the sort of thing that took Sandy across to France. They left from Felixstowe on the 5th of June. And again, the journal describes beautifully his passage through the English Channel, the Straits of Dover, where they lose one of the LST to an enemy mine, and then arriving off the Normandy coast on the afternoon of D-Day. So that first chapter is essentially a kind of low-level view of the experience of the concentration and the departure for France. The great miracle of organisation, as Sandy describes it in his journal. The next chapter then deals with the early part of Sandy's experiences in France. So he lands on Gold Beach on the morning of the 7th of June. He was supposed to go ashore on the evening tide on D-Day, but there were various delays to landing, not just for him, but for many thousands of personnel. And he actually went ashore on the morning of D+1. So he waded ashore through the shallows of Gold Beach. No enemy opposition at that time. It had all been defeated. Probably at about 11 o'clock on the morning of D+1. Now he went to the beach dressing station where wounded soldiers were being treated and was told by another chaplain who was already there, you're not needed here. Go inland to the village of Vers-sur-Mer where there is a field dressing station, a rather more sort of organised medical facility being established, and see what you can do to help there. And I'll read you a little bit of his experience there in a minute or two. So he goes off on the afternoon and he spends several hours working with or providing reassurance to wounded who he finds in the field dressing station. Later that day, he begins the process of burying the dead. And again, I'll read you a section because for me, at least, it's one of the most moving parts of the entire journal. And during the next week or so, he personally is involved in the burial of around 200 British and German military personnel. And he personally searches the bodies of each of them for identification before he carries out that burial. So I will read you a little bit because his words speak far better than I possibly can. So he's told to go to the field dressing station. He says, the road to the dressing station ascended sharply from the lateral road for about half a mile and was then level. It was crowded with vehicles and one had to keep well to the side and at the same time to keep on the road itself, for the verges were heavily mined. Clouds of dust smothered everybody. After 3/4 of a mile, toiling and sweating with my pack, I came to a small village, Montfleury, with only a few houses standing. Then came a chateau in large grounds. 2 old ladies lived there, and they had both died during the naval bombardment, although the house was not damaged except for a few windows blown. At a junction there's a war memorial, and here a crowd of prisoners was waiting to be moved. The village of Vers-sur-Mer started on the other side of the chateau grounds, and our regimental headquarters was the first large house on the left, this house. I saw our sign, 282, the recognition number, and Major Jim Morgan, the 2IC, the second in command, at the gate. So I slipped off my packs, left them in his care, and went on about 50 yards to the girls' school on the other side of the road. This was being used as the field dressing station, whilst marquees were being erected in a field behind. The rooms were full of wounded, and I was told there were many dead in the church across the road. This church was not badly damaged and had on the side of the tower near the top a wooden construction which the Germans had built as an observation post. For 2 hours I stayed in the field dressing station talking to men. They were on stretchers on the floor, and as was only a space of about 1 foot between each, it was impossible even to kneel beside the men. So I had to go 1 foot behind the other and sort of kneel, sitting on the heel of the foot at the back. After half an hour of this, and still wet from my landing, I had cramp every time I moved to the next men. They were very cheery, that is, those who were conscious in spite of their pain. One lad had lost a leg at the thigh and an arm just above the elbow, and he was badly cut in the face as well. Yet he said he was not going to let these things get him down. He knew he would be fitted with artificial limbs and taught a trade, and was going to make a fresh start in life for himself, his wife, and his little child, 1 year old. He was pathetically eager to get home and asked me again and again if the medical orderly had written out his embarkation ticket. Amphibious trucks were on the roadway waiting to be loaded with wounded, and then to convey them over the road and sea to the hospital ships. I said he was sure to get home, and he would be one of the first. Just then his ticket was pinned to his blankets. He said, "There, sir, I knew I was going home." I buried him the next afternoon. The amphibious trucks had been loaded all right, but the sea was too rough when they arrived, so the men were brought back to the field dressing station. The return must have been too much for this man, too much for his spirits to bear, and he just died on the way back. And that experience resonates, obviously, or resonated with Sandy for many years, I would say, because he wrote and rewrote a poem about it, which is included in the book, about that particular chap, and I think the original copy is at the back, actually, so if you wanted to see them. Yeah, well, exactly, one of the versions, absolutely. Later on, as I say, he goes, he's told to bury the dead, so I'll just move forward a little bit. So he's told there are people waiting to be buried. About 1300 hours, I went back to the regimental headquarters and swallowed a cup of tea, then on to the church. There were 21 bodies on stretchers, covered with blankets, in the chancel and lady chapel. A thick film of dust covered everything, and there was a large hole in the north wall near the roof. Death en masse is a queer, revolting smell. I did not look at the bodies then, but went to see about the burial plot. The official one was on the beach, but I was told it was waterlogged and still under fire from snipers in a small wood nearby. I went to see the staff captain of the 104th Beach sub-area, that's a logistical unit, and he asked me to find a suitable spot near the field dressing station if possible. I found a large field just behind RRHQ and chose the far corner to the east. The ground had not been tested for mines, but as there was a cow quietly feeding there, I decided it was safe. The next problem was to find pioneers for moving the bodies, grave digging, and straightening the dead. 104th Beach sub-area could provide none, as all pioneers were urgently needed for unloading and road work. In the end, the officer commanding the field dressing station lent me a party of 8 with a 3-ton lorry and driver. The driver and 3 others went to the church to load the bodies, and I took the remaining 5 men to the field, where I measured out a plot and we began to dig 2 trenches, one for the British and Allied dead and one for the enemy. When the first load arrived and were deposited on the ground, I stopped digging and went to them, just mounds on the ground covered with a blanket. Boots at various incongruous angles stuck out from beneath the blankets. At that moment, an elderly Roman Catholic padre arrived and offered to help. His help consisted of taking out a burial pen and pencil, so I knew he was not going to touch the bodies. After one deep breath, I leaned down and uncovered the top part of the first body and started to tremble at the sight. There was just a grotesque face stuck on a body. The head had vanished and left behind this horrible mask, resting on the neck, now covered with grime and with wide open eyes. I thought I was going to be violently sick, but remembered that this was part of the job I had come to do. I cut off one of the identity discs and began to search his pockets for personal effects. Unless you have done it, you have no idea of the sensation of searching a dead man's pockets. It was sheer hard work. In most cases, their clothes were soaking with seawater and caked in hard blood, and the pocket buttons and battle dress buttons had to be cut off. Personal effects were put into a small white cotton bag, and affixed to this was a tag for the man's number and name, that is, if one could be found. This first one was the body of a doctor, his age 28. It is important, of course, that great care is taken in identification, but many of them wore no discs and were so wounded that their papers were burned or destroyed. The second body was shattered from neck to loins, just a mass of broken flesh and bone and clothing, and I could find no papers or disc. Just as I was covering it, I saw a bit of white paper in the body deep down. By this time I had lost my squeamishness and put my hand into the mangled mass and withdrew the paper, looked at it and said, "Thank God," for it was the top portion of the page of his pay book which gave his name and number. It was better for the man's people to know definitely that he is killed than to go on hoping desperately and unavailingly for years. There were no pretty sights, not one calm face such as one would see with death in peaceful times. They were all grimy and intensely pathetic. Some had been laid on their faces because of wounds in the back, and I had to roll them over onto another blanket to get at their pockets. Some were legless or armless or both. Some had just a long splintered bone covered in parts with bits of flesh. Nearly all the pocket books I opened had in them some treasured family possession, generally a photograph of the family, wives, sweethearts, children, and these, as well as the poor bodies at my feet, made me weep, not with sorrow, but with hellish rage that such things should be. I wanted to have there all who cause war, and force them to stare and stare at what I saw. What an insult to the Creator that these creatures which He shaped should be so mangled and smashed. For a time I even forgot that the soul was not there, neither destroyed. Meantime, other bodies were being brought in from the beach. After identifying, or failing to identify, to the number of 40, it was 10 o'clock in the evening, and I was exhausted with lifting and struggling. We had laid 40 side by side in the trench that had been dug, and the Roman Catholic padre and I read the service, after which we covered them lightly until morning and left them there, with many others on the field still to be attended to. As I walked back to headquarters quite nearby, I started to tremble and could not stop. So when I got there, I opened my bag and drank a third of a bottle of whiskey, neat. Then took up a spade and looked for a spot in the garden where I could dig a trench to sleep in. Major Morgan must have seen I was fagged out and said I must join him in his trench. So in we got, not even taking our boots off. It was long enough and deep enough to fit our bodies tightly wedged. We lay on a ground sheet and piled greatcoats, blankets and mackintosh on top of us, and soon we were asleep, though it was impossible to turn over, and I ached from head to foot every time I tried to move, which was often. Which, to me, I mean, there are many affecting parts of the journal, but that's certainly one of the most affecting, and I would suggest that that experience lived with Sandy for the rest of his life, absolutely. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, one of his major jobs is delivering services, religious services on a Sunday, but at other times too. The first Sunday service that he delivered was actually in the garden of the regimental headquarters on the Sunday the 11th of June. But while he was there, he chose this, which is an outhouse, an outbuilding of the house itself, to establish a chapel that would be less subject, obviously, to the effects of the elements and would be more suited for services. So the little garage kind of gateway that you can see, or door that you can see here, is sketched in the original sketch again by Major Evans, Captain Evans rather, who was the battery captain of one of the batteries in the regiment, is shown in the lower part of this slide. So initially it's just sort of a sheltered space, but later a company of, well, either Royal Engineers or possibly Canadian Engineers, it's not quite clear which, came along and improved the chapel in the way that you can see here. So the benches were constructed out of wood from damaged houses, and eventually an altar was built again using rubble from a destroyed wall in Vers-sur-Mer. And then you can see in this sketch, very prominent, an altar cross made from a sheet of copper found in a German workshop in Vers-sur-Mer, probably by the same company or field squadron rather of engineers, and modelled on a Norman cross found in the church. And I'll come back to the cross later on. Okay, so he gets his chapel, and the first service takes place on the Sunday the 18th of June in that chapel. The next chapter of the book, so the third real chapter of his journal, covers the rest of the Normandy campaign and his experiences during the Normandy campaign, which, broadly speaking, are fairly routine, actually. There's nothing remarkably exciting about them, but the absolute bread and butter work of an army chaplain. Now, it's important to realise that once the regiment had landed, its guns were spread out over a very large area. Okay, you don't concentrate them all in one field and have 850 people all sitting in that field. They're all over the place over several square miles. And this photograph, which is from the Imperial War Museum archive, very fortunately, because the number of photographs taken in Normandy was nowhere near as large as some of you might perhaps instinctively imagine, actually shows one of the guns of the regiment. So it was lovely to find this in the Imperial War Museum and to find out actually that it belonged to 120th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment. So the guns were spread out, and that meant that if Sandy was going to do his job, it meant visiting the soldiers. They weren't going to come to him. He had to go out to the dispersed gun location. So this photograph, which isn't of Sandy but of a Canadian chaplain, shows arguably the most important bit of kit that any Padre had in Normandy or Northwest Europe, which is the Jeep. Okay, so they all have a Jeep, they all have a driver, Batman, who works with them, a soldier's servant if you like, and then of course the various paraphernalia of the chaplain's job. But it's this thing that allows Sandy to go out and to visit the soldiers at the dispersed gun sites and to deliver services at the various batteries and other sort of subunits. While in Normandy, again, we were talking earlier on, I was talking earlier on about this providing sort of welfare services to soldiers. Some denominations didn't like this. Catholic Church prevented their chaplains from doing it, and Anglo-Catholics were also stopped from doing it because they felt, no, your job is not to set up sort of reading rooms and entertainments and so forth. Your job is to focus on the spiritual dimension. Sandy, absolutely fine with doing it. In fact, I would say it's one of the big themes of the book, his attempt to reach out to the soldiers and make their lives comfortable. I'm not an especially religious person. What I liked about Sandy's journal is basic humanity. He was a decent human being who wanted to make the miserable lives of soldiers on campaign a little bit less miserable. That's what I really liked about his journal. It's not sort of full of piosity and religiosity and those kinds of things. It's a real human being doing decent things to help soldiers get through the campaign. So this photograph isn't taken actually in his reading and writing room. There are no photographs, but it's a very similar one that was established in a little bit along the coast at Sword Beach by the 3rd Division's chaplains. But it's a sort of place where soldiers can go, and rather than sitting in a slit trench, they can sit on a proper chair, and they can sit down at a table, and they can read a book or a magazine, and they can write to their wives and their families about their lives. So this is, it's very, very basic, but it's absolutely essential for the soldiers out in Normandy. So he sets up a reading and writing room in the girls' school, just over the road from the regimental headquarters, which is used by the soldiers throughout their time in Normandy. The chapter also describes some rather interesting visits that he made to significant sites within Normandy. So he went off to Pegasus Bridge. Some of you will know the story of the great gallantry displayed by members of the 2nd Oxon Bucks Light Infantry to capture Pegasus Bridge on the morning of D-Day, and that's amongst the places that he visits and describes. The radar station at Douvres, which held out in German hands behind British lines for about 11 days after D-Day. Visits the Mulberry Harbour, and again some terrific descriptions of these sites in the journal. Goes off to Bayeux on the 14th of June, which is the day that de Gaulle, the French Free French leader, arrives back in Normandy. He also describes in the journal life with the Norman population. Now this rather nice photograph, bottom right, shows some soldiers at a village lavoir with two of the women of the village washing clothes, and they're all smiling. And of course the reception of the British and American armies and Canadian armies in Normandy was generally a good one. You know, the French were pleased to be liberated. But there are also tensions, because after all, the French are having war brought to their doorsteps. Their towns, their farms, their villages are being flattened, their cows, their livestock are being killed, and many of their family members also. So it's worth bearing in mind that in the 3-day département of Lower Normandy where the campaign took place, 14,000 French civilians lost their lives during the Normandy campaign. In fact, more French civilians died in one town, Lisieux, on the night of the 6th, 7th of June, when we bombed that town, than died on Gold, Juno and Sword beaches added together. Yeah? So the French civilian experience was also, and that created some tensions. So the journal is very interesting on that kind of ambivalence. Delight that the Allies have landed, but also resentment, and to a degree also exploitation, because the French now had a ready market for agricultural produce and so forth, which they could sell at vastly inflated prices. But I'll read you another little extract from the journal, which is actually slightly more humorous. So on Bastille Day, the 14th of July, there was a service that Sandy was asked to participate in. This is his description, which is a little bit more humorous to offset perhaps the one that I read a few minutes ago. The village next to us is Crépon, and Major St. Martin's battery was stationed there. That was a heavy anti-aircraft unit. He came and invited me to go over and represent the Protestants. There was to be a mass in the church at 10 o'clock, and I went the previous evening to meet the curé. He invited me to read prayers after mass in English, but I refused, as I knew the Dean of Bayeux had issued instructions that disciplinary action would be taken against any priest who allowed Protestants to take part in any service in a Roman Catholic church. I compromised by promising to announce the numbers of 2 hymns which the soldiers would sing. The next morning I arrived at 9:55, and the church was already filled with troops and civilians. It's a beautiful old 11th century church, spoiled of course with tawdry trimmings. The curé escorted me to the front pew, where the mayor and Major St. Martin were sitting in solitary stare. It was low mass, and of course I was lost, as were most of the troops. After the mass, the men paraded for inspection. The men were lined up and looked very smart, 3 lines of them. The mayor should have walked along the 3 lines, followed by the major and then me, but instead he took off his hat and stood to attention with the troops behind him. As neither St. Martin nor I were sufficiently expert at French, we looked at each other and he said, "What do we do now?" I said, "Try and make him understand that he has to walk first and then we follow him." So with many gestures, the major indicated to the mayor what he wanted to do. But the mayor, with French politeness, refused to walk first. We compromised. The major first, then I gave the mayor a dig in the back and he followed. All this time the troops had stood rigidly at attention and with eyes straight ahead, but many of them were purple in the face, and I'm sure they wanted to explode into roars of laughter but dared not. When the inspection was finished, great beads of sweat were trickling down Major St. Martin's face, and he was swearing violently under his breath. St. Martin, by the way, is of a French family. His grandfather was the last of a long line with the title of Marquis St. Martin. His father was first secretary at the first British embassy in Holland. The 3 of us adjourned to a little cafe where we tried valiantly to hold a conversation with the mayor and to swallow easily 6 cognacs in quick succession, which put me in rather a belligerent mood, and I returned to regimental headquarters and told the commanding officer and the rest of the men my frank opinion of them. So there's humour in the accounts as well. So let's move on. Getting towards it. So the last major chapter of the book, or the journal at least, describes his experiences from the breakout in Normandy to November 44, when he ends up at a place called Gurs in the Netherlands. So just very briefly to show you, what this map shows is, of course, the breakout from Normandy and the advance of the Allied armies in the general direction of Germany from Normandy, where the battle had been fought, until late August. So the green lines or arrows show American forces driving towards Luxembourg and the German border. The dashed line in the centre shows the British Second Army, Miles Dempsey's army, driving up towards Brussels, and then, of course, eventually towards Arnhem and the Market Garden operation in mid-September. But on their flank, on their left flank, the Canadian First Army, operating in quite a narrow sector, essentially to clear the coastal strip, in particular trying to recapture port facilities, which would be very important for the Allies' logistical build-up, like Dieppe and Boulogne and Calais and these sorts of places, many of which the Germans transformed into fortresses. So even though the Germans were retreating or being defeated, many of their forces fell back into these coastal towns, and in fact held some of them until May 1945. They actually remained in German hands. Sandy Reynolds actually spends most of his time, a large part of this time in this chapter of the journal, with the Canadians, not with the British. So he's with the British Second Army, and initially at the end of August crosses the River Seine at Elbeuf and then moves to Amiens, or near Amiens, just a little bit to southwest of Amiens, which is where the regiment installed its guns to protect the bridges over the River Somme against German air attacks. Okay, so important bridges were there. But then in September he moves to Boulogne in the Canadian sector, as you can see, where the Canadians were fighting very hard to capture, eventually they did capture, the port of Boulogne, and then to clear the area around Cap Gris-Nez on the sort of the shortest distance across the English Channel. Later on, then, in October, he moves up to near Bruges, where the Canadians are fighting to clear a pocket of Germans. This area was known as the Breskins pocket, which the Germans were very keen to hold because it dominated the entrance to the Scheldt estuary. The Scheldt estuary leads to Antwerp, which in 1944 was the most significant single port in northwest Europe. So the Germans were very keen, even after Antwerp fell to the British, to prevent the British and the Canadians or the Americans exploiting this port by dominating the entrance to the Scheldt. So there's very heavy fighting in October, November around the mouth of the Scheldt estuary. And then in November, when eventually the Germans are driven out, in early November, Sandy Reynolds' regiment moves to here on the South Beveland Peninsula to a town called Gers, which is where it remains until the end of the war. So he's operating essentially in this area. So the chapter again describes his experiences during this period. So initially, as I showed you on the map, his regiment moves to Amiens, and the regimental headquarters was briefly in this chateau at a place called Quevilliers, which is about 10 miles to the southwest of Amiens. Whilst he was quartered there, he visited the regiment in Amiens. There's some terrific descriptions of the citadel at Amiens, which was being used at this time as a prisoner facility for Germans who were being brought in particular by Free French fighters, so by French resistance fighters who were mopping them up in villages and woods around the area and bringing them to the citadel at Amiens. Also, a very moving description of the excavation of executed members of the French resistance, because the Germans had used the citadel at Amiens as a prisoner facility of their own for interrogation, torture, and for the concentration of Jews before they were then sent to extermination camps in Poland. So that's quite powerful. He also visited Fécamp, the Benedictine monastery there, bought some bottles of Benedictine while he was there, and then also visited his brother's grave. So this is near Cambrai. And one of the factors that probably influenced Sandy to join up in the first place was the fact that one of his brothers, elder brother obviously because he was the youngest, was killed in action end of September I think, 1918, so very close to the end of the war, William, or Billy, as he was known. So he visited Billy's grave, which is in the back row, I think, about halfway along the back row at the Havrincourt. Yeah, Havrincourt Cemetery, which is near Cambrai. So there's a description of that as well. Then, as I say, they moved to near Boulogne, specifically to a fortress called the Fort de la Crèche, where again some very powerful descriptions of trying to bring bodies, German bodies in this case, out of a dressing station that was in the interior of the Fort de la Crèche and being shelled by German guns up at the Cap de Gris-Nez. Later on, as I mentioned, he goes off to a place near Bruges, where the regiment is again concentrated, and then eventually to Gers in the Netherlands, South Beveland, where the regiment remains until VE Day. Now again, humorous little episode. where he mediates at a local brothel, of all places. So, quote, "Our Royal Electrical and Mechanical Detachment, which was responsible for vehicle and equipment maintenance, was at Wimereux. One day on a visit there, one of the men asked to see me. So I took him into a corner and he told me an amazing thing. He had been to a brothel and fallen in love, so he said, with one of the women there. She could not speak English, he could not speak French. He wanted to marry her, and would I go with him to pop the question? I told him exactly what I thought about him, but it was useless to argue with him on moral grounds as he is a free thinker. He was really very troubled in mind, so in the end I said I would go if the medical officer accompanied us, as the place was officially out of bounds and he was the only person with the right to enter. We went the next morning. We were shown into a small room furnished with bare wooden chairs and tables and smelling of stale beer and tobacco smoke. Madame came in. She was the hardest-faced woman I have ever seen. Her face was a mask which cracked occasionally into an unpleasant smile. Her eyes were like gimlets and missed nothing. In our best French we told her our errand, and she went out and brought back the girl in question, who was very pretty in a flashy way. She would give no definite answer to the boy and refused to give up her trade, but promised to take his address and write to him and let him know if at any time she felt any desire to marry him. We went, and immediately I was out of the door, I saw my driver's face as he sat in the car. It was a picture to behold. Indignation is too weak a word. As soon as he saw me, he asked me what I meant by leaving him outside such a place, and I roared with laughter. There was my car, painted with Chaplain to the Forces in large letters on the front, outside a brothel. He told me that half the regimental lorries, and many more besides, had passed by during that half hour.
He never lived it down.
No, I'm sure he didn't. So, coming to an end now. I appreciate you being very patient, and I should stop. So, end of the war, occupation duties in Germany. At the end of the war, the regiment isn't disbanded immediately. It's sent, along with a large part of the other British forces, off to Western Germany, to the area of North Rhine-Westphalia, just where I put this little star here. Whilst the regiment was on occupation duties there, Alexander Reynolds received a mention in dispatches, which is actually a really rare thing for chaplains. Less than 9% of all chaplains got a mention in dispatches, so it's quite a sort of acknowledgement of the role that he had played. The regiment then moved to a place called Bochum, which is, and then to Emsdetten, which is very close again, where the star is shown here. The regiment was disbanded. Officers started going home in the summer of 1945, and the regiment itself only had about half of its personnel left when it entered 1946. And Sandy is still there with it, but most of the officers by that point had gone home, and the regiment was formally disbanded. Now, Alexander Reynolds didn't come home with the regiment. He was by this point actually double-hatted, because he was also the chaplain to the 76th Anti-Aircraft Brigade. And so he was sent to Münster, which is nearby, to a transit camp there. Whilst he was there, he ran a rest home for soldiers, so he commandeered a surviving German house, invited between sort of 4 and 6 soldiers to stay there for 48 hours at a time, again to give them a break from their soldierly duties. He officiated at a wedding there and worked with some of the German churches. There's some interesting stuff in the journal again, or in the papers that I found, I should say, and Georgina provided with me on attempts at reconciliation in the immediate aftermath of the war. So the denazification process. And then eventually comes home at the beginning of autumn 1946, when the regiment has completely gone and he comes home too. Some photographs very briefly taken whilst he was in Germany. This is a photograph of the regimental headquarters taken in October 45. Sandy's just here. This is Jim Morgan, who was the second in command of the regiment and took it over after Lieutenant Colonel Allen came home. And this is Tony Crowther. And we were delighted because about a month ago, got a letter from Tony Crowther's daughter saying that she'd come across the book, or her daughter had come across the book, and it was lovely to receive that. So that was a nice thing. This is the wedding that he officiated at. So this was a woman working in the YMCA and a soldier, an officer who she married, and this is the rest home that Sandy opened up. I'll bring it to a halt because I'd lost track of the time, I must admit, and hadn't realised we were a bit late. So after the war, what does he do? Well, he comes home, obviously. And he moves around quite a lot. So he had an urban parish in Preston for a few years after the war, then to North Somerset, mining communities for the early 1950s, and then probably the happiest time of his life, would that be fair to say, Georgina, in the Candover Valley? So throughout a large part of the 50s and the early 60s, not far from Basingstoke. And that photograph is of Northington Church?
Where they do the
Oops.
rather like blind.
And then finally, for the last few years of his life, back to an urban parish in Leeds, which sounds like it was dogged hard work. Never lost his affection for, affinity with soldiers. Remained a territorial army chaplain for most of the post-war period. This photograph is taken when he was with the 44th 50th Royal Tank Regiment on a training camp up in Scotland, and he's just sitting at the end of the line there. And he certainly also helped at least a couple of veterans of the Malayan emergency and the Korean War with PTSD afterwards. But his health seems to have been declining. He was a smoker, seems like very hard work in places like Leeds, and sadly he died suddenly at home in April 1966. But I'll just leave you with a few words from somebody who knew him very, very well, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Morgan, who was second in command of the regiment for most of the war, who described him in a letter to Georgina back in the 80s as a fine, dedicated padre with a great sense of humour. We all loved him for his courage and his kindness. So, ladies and gentlemen, I apologise. I went on about half an hour longer than I intended to, but thank you very much for your patience in listening, and I hope you found it interesting. We can talk about this in a minute. So if you have questions of any kind, yes, and if you need to leave, absolutely, but by all means. And then I'll just fill in a few words on the Copper Cross. But any questions?
You mentioned the dates of the diary. It brings the question why people wrote diaries. You know, you expect someone to write diaries throughout their lives. It's a constant habit.
Yes.
But so often with wartime diaries, they're just for a specific period of time.
Yes, I mean, what one gets, Georgina, I'm sure, has got some views on this as well. I mean, we've not found, or Georgina hasn't found, stuff on either side. It may very well be that it existed at some time. The journal from which I worked, which represents the text in the book, is on the back there, and was clearly written up either during post-war duties in Germany or perhaps subsequently on the basis of another document. We can tell this from the tenses which are used in various places. So the original diary is missing, and it may have been more extensive. But I get the impression that really it was when he got to Orwell Park that he thought, right, things are really starting now. And he starts to make a series of jottings and notes, which he then consolidates into something a little bit more formal as time passes. Whether he was simply too busy in November 1944 to maintain the diary, I don't know. It's a shame, because it would be lovely to get a sense of the context, especially before, but also, you know, how he reflected on this period afterwards. Keeping diaries, of course, technically speaking, was against the rules. The guys weren't supposed to keep diaries because it obviously a security concern if they fell into enemy's hands, but an awful lot of soldiers did. Likewise, soldiers were not supposed to take cameras with them, but an awful lot did. So, you know, many of the photographs that are taken, you know, and which are now available are technically speaking against the rules. But the diary, I don't know, Georgina, have you got any sort of comments further on the diary?
Having thought about it quite a lot, I think he wrote it as a way of dealing with his own stress. Because everybody brought their stress to him. And in those days there wasn't the help that there is now for people in the military. And of course this put an awful burden on him. And I think writing the journal was his only way of dealing with his own and everybody else's stress. And that's why I'm giving the books that, you know, I sell, all the profits are going to combat stress, because we think more and more is needed for these brave military people.
Yeah, I must say my own, because my interest was Air Force, and certainly one motive, certainly for a diary, was self-therapy, if you like. But also some people that, well, I'm doing a really important job. Oh, it's a little bit of a narcissistic thing.
Yeah.
And even in what this would be, I'll get this published one day.
Yeah. Yeah. No, possibly
You know,
so.
there's
Yeah,
a
some people
variety.
write with a view to later publication. Absolutely. Yeah.
But certainly self-therapy was
Yeah.
an important factor.
Because I didn't find any of this material, because there's quite a lot of it, that Simon's covered the main bits, but right up till 1946-47 when he was working in Germany with reconciliation. I didn't find anything of it until after both my parents had died. So they obviously, and Father wouldn't, I mean, I had no idea that he'd written this. My mother never told me. They never spoke about it. So definitely it wasn't a thing that they had in mind for publishing.
Oh, no.
It was definitely a personal thing for their own, for his own.
I mean, one of the
Health.
most remarkable things of public, just a matter of interest, was The Great Escape, Paul Brickhill.
Mm.
And he, on the long march,
Mm.
suffered terribly.
Mm.
But in there, he had the diary. The Great Escape was actually written in the prison camp. It's
Interesting,
absolutely
interesting.
incredible.
Yeah.
And the danger there, security
Yeah.
and so on, taking that,
Yeah.
he took it on the long march.
Treasured possession. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, many of you would have been aware of Sandy Reynolds kind of at second or third hand, even before the journal was discovered and turned into the book, because no doubt many of you have watched the Festivals of Remembrance over the years on television. And the Copper Cross, which is here, this is the original Copper Cross, which was fashioned as the Altar Cross back in June 1944, Canadian or British engineers. You know, Sandy used it throughout the Northwest European campaign, brought it home after the war. When he went to the Candover Valley in the mid-1950s, they didn't have a processional cross, did they?
No.
So it was converted into this, the processional cross, and it's been used at the Festivals of Remembrance 1984, 94, 2004, 2014.
Yes.
And then this year, in the Guards Chapel in Wellington Barracks in London for the centenary service commemoration for the Royal Army Chaplains Corps as well.
Yes.
So if you've watched these in any year ending with a 4 since 1984, you will have seen the processional cross actually being used, even though you might not have known where it came from. So it's rather nice. And this is it back in situ. You took it back in, when's this? 2014? Was that with your son and daughter? 2014?
No, that's
Earlier, is it?
84.
Oh, that's 84, is it? Yes. No, that's absolutely.
Car park.
No, that's okay. You've got a car park. Yeah.
84.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you.
I think that might be 94.
Okay,
I
90.
can't remember.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So.
Can I ask, did you receive any letters from him during this period at home? Did you?
Not
your
that I
mother
know of.
receive anything?
I should imagine my mother received
I
letters.
wondered,
Yes, there are a bundle of letters, aren't there? Which
Only
I
one
can't
would
bear to
think that-
read.
Yes, no, but I think we would
Yeah.
be, because my
Yeah.
father managed to
Yes,
send letters home every now and
Mm.
again, but he was Navy,
but
so.
they're quite brief. I've got one or two of the telegrams when he got 48-hour leave saying, coming home with 12 soldiers.
Oh,
And there was my mother in a vicarage with no electricity, no telephone, and it was a nightmare because, one of my earliest memories is of seeing the hall full of all these soldier khaki legs and this figure sweeping me up into his arms and the smell of trains, cigarettes and cordite and wet wool. It's one of my earliest memories. Yes. But how my mother managed, I do not know. And she was running the parish while he was away, of course, and teaching. Yes. Mm. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for coming anyway. Hope you
Thank
enjoyed it.
you.
If you want to have a look at any books, you're very welcome to do so. Thank you very much.
And then I've done a display at the back of
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes, of course, absolutely. Yes, would you like to? Yes, absolutely.